Welcome to the History of Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. This week, Helen Carr. If you live in the UK, you've probably seen her all over the... She's doing something at all times, it looks like. Reading her book, The Sceptred Isle, I was riveted the whole time. It's the monarchy behaving badly and just screwing things up left and right. It's everything you want in a book. Helen is so easy to talk to. It was like having a day off trying to do this interview. So how about I shut up and we just hear from Helen? And here we are with author Helen Carr, The Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century. Helen, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Helen, I tried to kind of condense your bio. I think for anybody in the UK, they're going to immediately know who you are. But for American audiences, you're writing books, you're on TV, you're basically just everywhere. Would that be kind of safe to say?
Yeah, jack of all trades, master of none, perhaps, is a saying that we have over here.
Yeah, I think you're actually pretty much a master of most of them from what I hear. But listen, let's jump to the Sceptred Isle. It's 14th century. Why this time period? I know you have a previous book, John of Gaunt, so that kind of dovetails a little bit. But what made you say, I'm going from a bio to, well, a heck of a lot more?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think it was the fact that it was a biography that sort of tipped me into doing that heck of a lot more. Because when I was writing about John of Gaunt, you know, when you're writing biography, you are very stuck to that linear lifetime of somebody. You can't really digress too much from that, because you're just kind of veering off the point and you have to keep your focus on that person. And though so much of what Gaunt lived through and what he experienced and was involved in was phenomenally interesting and told so much of the story of the period just through his participation, which was why I wanted to write about him in the first place, it didn't allow me to explore much greater subjects. I was very interested in what happened before Gaunt was even born. I became interested in Edward II and the rumours around him and this sort of myth around his kingship and his favourites. And I was fascinated in characters like Isabella of France, his wife, events that happened, the Black Death, which was something that happened when Gaunt was only 8 years old. So it wasn't something that I could really go into too much detail in my biography of him. And I felt like this period specifically was so groundbreaking and revolutionary in the way that it shaped history going forward. I mean, this major pandemic right in the middle of the century being one, the 100 Years' War being another. But it was also a time where you had two regicides. I mean, that's pretty much unheard of in any other century in British history. And that was interesting to me because it really changed this idea of power and kingship, and it was the end of this very linear line of Plantagenet kings by 1399.
And that's a question, too, just choosing the starting and end point when there are so many interesting episodes you can jump into. As a historian, where do you say, all right, I have to start here because otherwise I'm starting at year one and it gets a little crazy?
Totally. Yeah, you sort of hope that it starts in the year 1300, something really amazing happens. But actually, it's more you do have to hang it on a point and on a moment. And originally, actually, when I started writing this and I sort of was pitching it, I wanted to start with the Battle of Bannockburn, because for me, the Battle of Bannockburn was probably one of the greatest battles that reshaped the way history moved forward thereafter, in that you had future kings borrowing battle tactics from the Scots after the Battle of Bannockburn. It was a battle that wiped out the sort of flower of chivalry in the earlier 14th century. It made the northern border practically a frontier zone. And it was an incredibly important battle politically and geopolitically as well. But that felt a little bit too difficult to sway when I was doing this whole kind of century. And I wanted to cover as much of the century as possible. And it also didn't allow me to cover things like Piers Gaveston and the relationship between Gaveston and Edward. So I decided to start it in 1307, which was the year that Edward I died and the year that his son Edward II ascended the throne. And so I cover a very, very, very little amount of the last sort of year or two of Edward's reign, just really in more of a kind of, this is what's happened so far, kind of reflective moment. But I think I didn't want to going too much into Edward, Longshanks, Hammer of the Scots, because, I mean, that's like a biography in itself. He's such a massive character. And it's sort of hanging on the end of his reign, which had been incredibly successful. He was a conqueror. He had conquered Wales. He had accrued a huge amount of land. He was a very successful military king. Not the nicest guy, as far as I'm aware. But I thought that it would be interesting to see how England shifted with the end of one reign and into another, and then everything sort of went so dramatically wrong from that point onwards.
But the author OCD kind of got really annoyed that it was 1307 and not just 7 years earlier. Just a little 7 would have helped a lot, right?
Yeah, especially when there's occasionally this one really cool thing that happens like in 1303 and you're like, oh, I wish I could put that in there. But I did find ways of sort of squeezing things in that were interesting to me that happened slightly earlier.
I've gotten into a lot of English history lately, and somebody that keeps coming up, of course, is somebody that didn't probably exist. How important was King Arthur to a lot of these kings? Because I think nowadays, especially for Americans, you're like, oh, that's kind of a great story. But for a lot of these actual monarchs, it kind of became the perfect example of English royalty, right?
Yeah, and it's really a very interesting sort of mythology and literary culture, really, which is where the roots of the Arthurian legends are. It's all in this sort of oral culture, the historical literacy of the Welsh, of Wales, actually. I think the stories of Arthur really sort of emerged around Wales. And so I think for people who are really interested in King Arthur, the best people to go to, the best historians to ask are literary historians, because Arthur was a literary character. He was a mythological character as far as we know. He didn't necessarily really exist. He might have been based on somebody, maybe. But it's all about storytelling and the storytelling culture of the early Middle Ages into the High Middle Ages, and what people value and what people are looking for and they find exciting and interesting and fascinating. And I think that that's what the Arthurian legends are, why they remain to be so interesting and fascinating to us today, because they're just brilliant storytelling. And they're these wonderful characters. You've got Lancelot and Guinevere, and their way that those characters have been molded over the centuries is very interesting as well, to sort of follow that development. But for English kings in the 14th century, Arthur became this sort of figurehead of kingship, and it all stems from Geoffrey of Monmouth, where these legendary stories came down, and Arthur was sort of imbued into the real family tree of kings, that the actual sort of the actual dynastic family tree, and he was sort of right at the top, and everyone sort of trickled down after him, which of course isn't true, because there was no sort of dynasty stemming after Arthur. But what it was more about what he represented and how he was an astute, politically minded king. He was militarily successful. And he created this incredible court. I mean, Camelot was the court that anybody wanted to sort of recreate for themselves. He was the pinnacle of kingship. He was like, if there was a How to Be a King for Dummies, it would be written by King Arthur. That's what he was set up to be. And so a lot of English kings thereafter, mostly those who were trying to recreate themselves in that image, used him as propaganda, really. They modelled themselves on him, mostly Edward I and then lastly Edward III.
It seems interesting to think back to the 14th century, and this was PR. Just solid PR was to take your name and put it with somebody who already has that built-in cachet that people already like, and say, I'm going to pay him homage because I'm going to be just like old Artie over there. Yeah,
exactly.
Even in the 14th century, PR is just so important.
Yeah, it's so important, because what you're doing is you're taking this popular cult figure and saying, this figure's values are my values. I'm sort of casting myself as Arthur reborn. Edward III, for example, was known in his lifetime by his contemporaries early on as Arthur Redivivus, which is Arthur reborn, and he very much sort of stepped into that with aplomb. I mean, he was a showman. Similarly, Edward I was fascinated by Arthurian legend, but it was his, again, it's propaganda and it's politics. It was his way of claiming Wales. By claiming their mythology, by claiming their storytelling and their culture, he was saying, I am the rightful king of this realm. And I think that is very interesting, as to when you're thinking about conquest, it's so much of it isn't just about armies moving into land and taking over. It's about stealing everything. It's about sort of enveloping people's culture and people's interests and the things that people hold dear, the things that make a nation what it is.
Going from good PR to bad PR, something that permeates just the whole book is choice of favorites for these monarchs and how they were, amazingly bad at it sometimes. Mm-hmm. Is this the part in history where choosing favorites really came back to bite them more than other times? It seems like there's just a lot jammed into this time of, hey, whoever you choose is your, we should say, bestie nowadays. You need to be careful that they're not land grubbing and ticking everyone off, because otherwise you may have a bad time. Is this special to this particular time period, or just kind of a bit more concentrated than normal?
I think it's quite concentrated. And I think it's particularly concentrated over two kings. Going back a little bit in Plantagenet history, what the King Henry II was very good at doing was getting the nobility in check. I mean, he was the first Plantagenet king to really realise, I need the nobility to be on my side, but they also need to revere me. And so he was very good at giving his nobles purpose. He was good at sort of allocating land, but also being very clear that he was the man in charge. If they screwed up, he was going to come down on them like a ton of bricks. Things would be taken away. He was top dog. He's king. He's the God given king. And that's something that you see sort of continue. There's always, throughout the Middle Ages, problems with nobility and the royalties. They're always falling out. I mean, you look at Henry III and Simon de Montfort, it's not a new thing. The noblemen are people with considerable power, but not as much power as the king, and they're not always going to align. But I think when we think about favourites, the most famous king to have had favourites was Edward II, notably Piers Gaveston being the first one, and then the Despensers, Hugh Despenser the younger being the second. And I think that what has become particularly well known about Edward II in regard to his favourites is what did that relationship look like. So we can park that for now, because I'm sure we're going to talk about sexuality later on. But favourites with Edward II, it was a whole different thing, because what you had in the Middle Ages is that traditional feudal hierarchical structure of that pyramid, where you've got the king at the top, and then you've got the nobility just below, and then you've got the the merchants, and then the peasants, and then the serfs right at the bottom. And what Edward did is he picked out his favourites, but instead of kind of placing them just in that level of nobility and where he was in charge, but they were sort of interacting and he was having a great time with them, he was relying on them to give him advice. He was sharing his power, and he was elevating theirs to a point where it was disparate to the other major nobles of the time. So these noblemen under Edward, some of them were royal. I mean, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, was Edward's cousin. He had royal blood pulsing through his veins, but he wasn't given the same rights as Piers Gaveston, who really had just been a squire from Gascony. And that's going to really peeve off in the nobility. I mean, these are land-owning men. They're very powerful. They hold a lot of feudal power, and they hold a lot of influence as well. And when they all get individually irked because the king is just really giving away land to his favourites they consider to be corrupting him, when they come together, they can be quite a formidable force. So Edward really screwed up by elevating his favourites and not really taking into account that he needed also to keep his nobility on side. Part of a king's job is to respect that you have that level of, to respect that traditional hierarchy, but also to understand that the nobles are important figures within the realm, and you need to keep them on your side by giving them something that they feel they're aspiring to. And that changed under Edward III, because he was a king that really recognised this. And that's why he created institutions like the Order of the Garter, because he wanted to create something that the nobles would flock to. It was like an aspirational institution. To belong to the Order of the Garter was to belong to something. It was the beginning of that sort of development of nationalism and patriotism. And with Edward at the top, he was still saying, I am king, but you are all part of my team. You know, it's like having the captain and then the rest of the team. It's a very natural feeling to want to belong to something, and to feel that, you know, if you're getting lots of people who have lots of power all together and they get all buoyed up by it, it's going to create quite a formidable, unbreakable force. And so that's what Edward III was very successful at doing. And then you look at Richard II, who again was much like Edward II, in that he had a few favourites, less famously than Edward II did. But what he wasn't very good was keeping his nobility on side. He let all of that just kind of crumble away. And he considered himself as top dog. He considered himself as the ultimate authority. He didn't need his nobility. He didn't need them on side. He was always falling out with them. But he was the one who was, unequivocally always right, because he was the one who was divinely appointed as king and everybody should listen to him. So really, of all of those three kings that I cover in the book, Edward III is the one who had the best understanding of what it meant to create a secure, higher power in the realm. And that basically meant keeping your nobility, being on your side, being diplomatic, and being a king that the nobility revered, but they also wanted to please and to respect. And equally, the king respected them in turn.
And let's jump back. You said sexuality is a part of this, because especially when it comes to peers, everybody, it's like, oh, he did that. Edward gave him everything because they were lovers. I really like the nuance that you add to the book, because you say, first of all, we can't know, because a lot of the things that we would go back to and say, oh, well, here is proof of it, could just be very effusive letters. That's how people wrote back in the day, especially with somebody that was close. If you take the sexuality part of it, because we're never going to know, the choice of favorites, is it really just kind of ridiculous and reductive to say, oh, it had to do with sexuality, they were lovers? Or is there definitely more to it that you can see in the historical record of why Edward would have acted this way?
So much more. I think what's interesting to me is the psychologies of these people, because major themes within my book are humanity and power. So I'm interested in the humanity of these kings and what makes them who they are as individuals, but also, lots of other characters within the book. And I think you have to look back to Edward's upbringing, like we all do, right? We have to think back to our upbringing and how that shaped us. Edward was the son of a bully. Edward I was a bully. He was famously hard on his son. He was the only heir, and he wanted him to rule in his image. But Edward was very different to his father. He wasn't as military-minded, but that doesn't mean that he was the aesthete and the sort of foppish prince that is depicted in movies like Braveheart, where he's walking around with his ermine and just sort of wandering around with a mirror. That is a caricature that is completely incorrect about Edward. I think he was far more sensitive. He was interested in people. He was very fun. He was kind. He was funny. He was incredibly generous. We know all of this. But he was also a young man who grew up with no brothers, completely opposite to his son, Edward III, who ended up having all of his sons, including John of Gaunt and the Black Prince, who were very, very close. They were this sort of, band of brothers and brothers in arms. And when he had very few male influences around him, his father began to put young men of his choosing in Edward's household. Piers Gaveston was one of them, probably chosen because he was good at war. He was a very skilled young warrior, soldier. He was a bit older than Edward, so his father probably thought he was going to teach him some of the arts of war. But they just got on very, very well. And the closeness that people often believe was homosexual, I think, was actually more likely. I'm not saying it wasn't homosexual, did not develop into something that was homosexual, but I think the origins of it was more likely what was known as a ritual brotherhood, which is like a marriage, but between soldiers or between two men. And it looked incredibly affectionate. It was deeply loving. I mean, there are examples of men, soldiers, who entered into these ritual brotherhoods being buried together. It was closer than a marriage. I mean, marriage in this period wasn't for most people the same as it is today. It wasn't that sort of, deeply loving, deep friendship between two people as it is today. I mean, you had that often with men more within these sort of military spheres, this closeness between men feeling deeply emotional at the loss of one of their brothers in arms. I mean, it was a closeness that women had with other women in their own household and men had in their gendered spheres as well. And ritual brotherhood was also something that was reflected in literature that Gaveston and Edward would have been reading at the time. There's the thinking of Arthurianisms and Arthurian legend. There is the story of Lancelot and Galahad, without going into too much detail because we'll be going off on a tangent, but Galahad was a giant who fell in love with Lancelot, but they fought together. They were, both soldiers, and they were buried together in the end. And it was actually deeply emotional and romantic and tragic, but it just happened to play out between two men. And so I think that Edward and Gaveston had a closeness that reflected this more than anything else. And the key giveaway as to how Edward considered Gaveston is written in the record as verbatim from him, not by him, but verbatim from him. And that is the word that he repeatedly uses about Gaveston, which he calls him brother. And that is how I think he saw Gaveston, as his brother. And I think that when we think about sexuality or the way that people express love, they're not going to have the same lexicon as we have today or use the same language. We have to be very careful not to apply our understanding of sexual language to or romantic language to people living in the 14th century. I think that's really important. So I imply in my book that Piers Gaveston and Edward II's relationship was queer. And what I mean by that is queer in that it was irregular to the way that most heterosexual male relationships would have played out, even in its time, because it was queer enough for contemporaries to comment on it. But it doesn't mean that it was sexual. That's where I go with it. But I mean, as you say, quite rightly, we can just never know.
You talked about too, as you're discussing this, is that brothers in arms war. It very much seems like, I think it's kind of no duh when you say it out loud, but if you're a king and you're good at war, you can get away with so much more. And these little problems of, the favorites get this and gets that, it seems that once you show that you don't have that golden touch when it comes to war, that's when the real problems start. Am I being reductive again, or does that kind of line up?
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, I mentioned the Battle of Bannockburn earlier, and I think that that's a really good example. If Edward had been successful at Bannockburn, if he had won Bannockburn, if he had reclaimed Scotland, if he had managed to capture Robert Bruce, then I think the outcome would have been very different. I don't think he would have necessarily gone to war against his cousin. I think it would have done a lot for his confidence as king. I think he would have had a lot more power and a lot more agency, because the Battle of Bannockburn, it was like a domino effect. He loses the Battle of Bannockburn, and then he has this sort of rigid set of the further implementation of this rigid set of rules imposed upon him, known as the Ordinances, which was this sort of bureaucratic administrative bind that Thomas Earl of Lancaster, Edward's cousin, put on him and put on his kingship. It was kind of like a sort of derivation of Magna Carta in the cans and cannots of kingship. I don't think that would have happened if it had been for the Battle of Bannockburn had been a success, because Edward had never really proved himself. He'd never proved himself as king, and he was expected to step into the shoes of his father, who had done a formidable job in conquering Wales and also against the Scots. I mean, and if he had lived longer, who knows how that would have played out. Perhaps he would have been successful in conquering Scotland too and overthrowing the Bruce kingship. But that's a lot of pressure on Edward, who wasn't a bad soldier, but he certainly wasn't a military strategist. And so I think it's exactly right. What is it we value about kings? What is it we define as good when it comes to kingship? And usually, for history and for the record, it's been kings who are good at war. I don't really see it on those terms, which is what I tried to also convey in this book. I tried to take a more nuanced approach.
Now, you mentioned this, and it was one of my next questions, so we'll jump right to it. And I've always wanted to ask somebody much smarter than me about this one. The Magna Carta, do we give it too much credit or too little credit? Because especially when you look at when it's signed and everybody's kind of like, this isn't going to work. There's no way he's going to follow this. And it generally kind of falls apart almost immediately. But it does start this move towards a different kind of government. So just from your perspective, do we give it too much credit, too little credit, about the right amount? What do you think?
Well, it was signed on multiple occasions over the course of, almost a century. And I think the last king, if I'm correct, to sign it was Edward I. I think he was the last one to sign another version of Magna Carta. So it is something, I think, that it's a household name, isn't it? Everybody is aware of Magna Carta, but nobody really not everybody knows exactly what it represents. And so I think it is a hugely important part of British history in that it strips a king of this sort of totalitarian rule, which King John was demonstrating at the time that it was signed. So it is very important. But I think what you do see after Magna Carta is, and you see it a lot in the 14th century, is this sort of wave of restrictions imposed on kings. It's like giving them opportunities again and again to do better, but it's like, we're going to just put a few more restrictions on you, and then when you can prove you need to prove that you can be a bit better, and then we'll keep putting the restrictions on you, because it's like, ultimately, we can't really trust you to do a proper job and do it well, so they're going to give you a long list of things you can't do to make sure that you stay in check. And that really was only a real problem for Edward II with the ordinances, and then later Richard II, mostly with him through just not really being given the authority at all. I mean, Richard II was at the same age that his father was, winning his spurs at the Battle of Crecy. Richard wasn't really allowed to do anything. He was still treated as if he were a 10-year-old. So I think that it was a way, Magna Carta was a wonderful and complicated means of restricting a king's power, because in the end, as I have said, kings were human beings and they were flawed. And it completely depends on luck of the draw as to what type of king you were going to get. And when you have a type of king like Edward II, who is so easily manipulated for individuals' personal gains, or you have a king like Richard II, who just has this unbelievable sense of his own majesty and righteousness, you need to have something that stops everything going completely pear-shaped under the rule of one individual.
So for the people, the Magna Carta is a wonderful thing and rights and everything. But for the monarch, it's generally, hey, we don't trust you and you kind of suck at this. So do me a favor and just sign this, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of good, bad, I'm going to send you back in time. You get to live, or you have to live. Let's say it that way. You have to live.
I bet you go to most historians going, well, actually, no, I'm very comfortable living in the 21st century. Thank you. Yeah. I have to live. Okay.
I send you back there in time. You get to choose which king you're going to live under. Who's it going to be and why?
It's going to be at the court of Edward III during the sort of peak 100 Years' War. Everything's going great. The fountains are running with red and white wine. He's hosting parties. He's dressing up as a pheasant. Lots of other people are dressing up in these really elaborate costumes. There's loads of jousts going on. Everyone's having way too much to drink. And there's loads of great food. And everyone is kind of celebrating King Arthur and saying, this is Arthur reborn. This is all wonderful. Because I think it just would have been probably one of the best parties to witness. It would have been one of the Garter feasts, probably.
And I'm guessing if I asked the opposite, you would just say any time that didn't have the Black Death.
Yeah. In a nutshell. Probably later on, though. We still wouldn't have been in the reign of Edward II. I think it probably would have been later, maybe into the later 14th century, because even though kings and their wars and their political machinations do have a ripple effect, I think there are so many people, when things are going a bit pear-shaped at home for Richard II and John of Gaunt, or Richard II and the Lords Appellant, there are lots of people who were just sort of getting on with their lives. And after the Black Death, people had far more opportunity in regard to careers and social mobility. So I think that would have been comparatively a better side of the Black Death to live, the after, rather than the before.
And you brought up our friend John of Gaunt. I wonder, so you wrote his biography first. In writing this book, did it change at all the way you looked at him? From when you wrote the bio on him, did anything kind of move around or make a little bit more sense or even less sense when it came to him?
I think perhaps a little more sense. I think that my opinion on him didn't really change, but it was interesting to have place him as more of a peripheral figure and a peripheral character rather than the centre of my focus. That was just quite interesting from an authorial perspective. But no, my opinion on him didn't change, which I'm quite relieved about, actually, because that makes me believe that I still did a good job on the first book.
Now, I'm going to take him off the possibilities here for this next question. I'm sending you back in time again, but now you get to interview anyone from the book. Again, we're taking Johnny out. That's too easy.
Yeah.
You get 1 hour with somebody from this book. Who's it going to be?
I think be really annoying and give you two. I think from the first... from the first half of the book, I would interview Isabella of France. I think she's phenomenally interesting, very clever, and I think it was her that really influenced the reign of her son, Edward III, more than his father did. And I'd like to understand her viewpoint after she had returned to England and around the deposition of her husband. And secondly, I would probably say I'd like to interview Richard II, because I just think I'd like to do it from the psychologist's chair and try to understand what exactly was going through his head and what kind of... Because there have been historians who've done some very convincing work kind of posthumously diagnosing Richard with various different psychological or mental health conditions, like borderline personality disorder is one, narcissistic personality disorder is another one. So I'd be interested to see if I could do the same from obviously meeting him firsthand.
See, I would choose Piers.
Yeah.
Just because...
He's so fun.
I'd want to know, because it's the same thing with everything in history, right? If you come out on the losing side, people are going to write what they want to write, and they're going to show things in a certain way to make you, if you're the loser, you're going to look as bad as possible. And I'd honestly probably just need 10 minutes to see, is he as obnoxious as everyone said he was? And I think you'd know pretty fast, probably.
I think he was really obnoxious. I think he was obnoxious, but I think he was harmless. And I think that harmless being relative, but I think, he was obnoxious and he was funny. And I think he and Edward just had a lot of fun together. I think they laughed a lot together. And I think that you can imagine them just being rude about all of the nobility in private and making up lots of nicknames for them. And Gaveston just saying all of these like scandalous things that Edward is like, oh my goodness, can't believe you're getting away with saying that. Like, that's so bad. And he was, I think, probably deeply amusing. Yeah, I think he's really interesting, but I think he's phenomenally naive, probably a bit stupid, completely didn't read the room is probably one of Piers Gaveston's major flaws. Otherwise, I don't think he would have been executed.
Now, there's a group of people that would probably be super annoyed that we didn't bring them up yet, which is Parliament. There's just too many, but I wondered, a lot of these parliaments have special names, specific names for like their... Mm-hmm. I want you to... What was your favorite one? Whether it's just because the name was funny or cool or they did something, what was your favorite parliament?
I think the most interesting parliament was the Merciless Parliament. The parliaments in the reign of Richard, I think there's a lot of change in those parliaments. That was when you saw the real tension and the political aggression that was playing out. You know, you can read it in the record playing out. And you've got, at the one point, you've got in the Merciless Parliament, you've got two Plantagenet princes sort of coming up against each other, Richard's uncles, because you've got the Duke of Gloucester, and then you've got Richard of Gloucester, Duke of Gloucester, and they're sort of they're almost about to sort of go into a fist fight with each other, and you can read it and it's sort of jumping off the record. And I think that those parliaments are very interesting. That happened in the Merciless Parliament, and you can really see in those parliaments in Richard's reign what happens and why the outcome of that parliament is what it is. So, for example, one of the most appalling acts in Richard's reign was in this Merciless Parliament was the arrest and execution of Simon Burley, who was Richard's former tutor, but also the closest thing he had from childhood, very young childhood, to a father. And it was so cruel and so unnecessary. And you really can see that decision taking place and it being enacted during the course of Parliament. And you can see the impact that had into the rest of Richard's reign and the consequences of it later on, as we know, because Richard effectively gets his own back.
Now, of course, we got connected through Hallie Rubenholt. So my next question is, you're writing, you're doing all of these things. Do you have time to read history yourself? And are there any recommendations, or do you have any friends with books coming out that you want to plug?
Sure. That's a really nice question. And I talk about that a lot because I think that as historians, we are a community and we support each other and promote each other and read each other's work. And I think that's so important. And the origins of public history is obviously in the academy and academia and universities. And part of your job in a university, whether you are studying for a PhD or whether you are actually part of the academic circle, is to commune, and it is to share research. And I love doing that on a more public platform as well. Do I have time to read other people's history books? Not really, is the answer. I don't have a lot of time. If I'm blurbing somebody's book or I'm saying that it's good or I enjoy it, I have read it. If I am reviewing a book, of course, I have read every word of it. But it is very difficult when you're writing your own work and you're sort of surrounded by history books all day to then say, yes, I can, in my downtime, also read more history books. So truthfully, no, I don't read as many as I should do or could, or perhaps, well, not could do, as I should do. But saying that, in my downtime, I like to read fiction, really good fiction. I like to read other non-fiction. I like to read for the artistry of it. And I'm very influenced by some of the classics. I'm very influenced by writers who aren't historians as well. I'm influenced by good writing. So if I think that there's a history book as well that I'm just really keen to read, I will read it. But that's not what I read at all. But yeah, when I have to read for work, I do. If I'm reviewing or I'm blurbing it, then of course I do. But there are definitely so many good books that I wish I had more time to read, of which I've got there. So the Joanne Paul's book on Thomas More that's coming out. I've managed to read about a chapter of it. But it's just so good. And she's just such a wonderful scholar. So I would really recommend Jo's book. Hallie is just the most fantastic writer. She writes so well. And she has this wonderful way of recovering these voices and stories from the archive and completely reshaping the way people think about it. And I think she's so talented with that. And in regard to other people's books that are coming out, I mean, Helen's Eagle in the Heart, which I read, of course, and reviewed, it was just brilliant. Just such a great example of scholarship, actually.
I might start calling her Queen Helen because everybody loves her.
Yeah, she's just great. She is great. I mean, she's incredibly talented, I think, is what it is. And I think that she she can write very well. And that's the thing. When you have somebody who's as talented as a historian and can also write very well, then it's a good combination.
There are these poor misguided souls out there who think history is boring. It's a class they took in high school and they never want to deal with it again. If I sat one of those folks in front of you and they said, Helen, I don't like history. Why should I read The Sceptred Isle? What would you say?
I would say that I completely understand why you don't like history, because history is often sold, particularly in early school years, and I think this is changing a bit with schools, but history is often sold as a sort of series of facts, and you have to learn your facts and your dates. And I always describe this to people as those old rulers that you used to get, where you'd have like the ruler of rulers, so you'd have all the kings and queens on a ruler, and they would be the sort of inches. And I always say the real work, the real historical work, and the interest and the fascination, the argument and all the anecdotes all comes out in the spaces in between those inches. That's where you get all of these stories and these wonderful human events that took place, or not so wonderful in many cases as well. That's where you find all of that incredible, interesting archival work, or you read about it. And I think that for me, that is the really interesting part of history. It's certainly not memorizing a series of dates. It's the stories. It's the way that humanity has developed over the centuries and the things we've done so wrong and the things we've done right as well. For me, it's those stories that are the most interesting.
Well, Helen, I love the book. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Helen, thank you so much for coming on The Sceptred Isle. It's fantastic. Go out and get it. Need I say more? No, I do not need to say more. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History